concept van. It's called the Tubic.
They looked futuristic, but some of the dumbest old car designs were disasters hiding in plain sight. How did features once praised as genius end up making no sense at all? Swingaway steering wheels were supposed to feel like stepping into the future. Introduced by Ford in the early 1960s, these steering wheels would shift to the side when you parked, giving you more room to exit the car. On paper, it made sense, an elegant solution to sliding across a wide bench seat in a tight suit or dress. In reality, it was an awkward, over-engineered gimmick. The mechanism jammed often, especially as the car aged or if the column was slightly misaligned. Some drivers would sit down only to find the wheel still stuck off-center. Others accidentally engaged it while driving, leading to moments of sheer panic as the steering shifted with a clang. It confused new owners and required specific handling to make it work smoothly. Worse, if it failed while the car was in motion, it could affect steering responsiveness. The idea of having a movable steering wheel sounds like science fiction even today, but Ford thought they had a winner. Instead, it was phased out quickly, relegated to the long list of ideas that looked good in a brochure but failed on the road. You could argue it was ahead of its time, or just too clever for its own good. Square steering wheels never stood a chance. Cadillac tried to push the boundaries with the Cimarron by offering a squared-off wheel that looked bold and modern in promotional photos. But the minute you wrapped your hands around it, the problems became obvious. Corners dug into your palms. Turning became awkward. There was no natural flow like with a traditional round wheel, and sharp corners did not translate well when driving on winding roads. The square shape made parking maneuvers uncomfortable and highway cruising just plain weird. It was all part of an attempt to modernize a car that already had an identity crisis. The Cimarron was often criticized as a glorified compact sedan with a luxury badge, and the square wheel only added to the confusion. It felt like a feature built for design committees and ad campaigns, not for real drivers with real hands. And unlike innovations that became staples, this one vanished quickly. There is a reason no mainstream car today has a square steering wheel. Sometimes being different is not the same as being better. In this case, it just made turning feel like a math problem. The third headlight on the Tucker 48 was one of those ideas that was both brilliant and baffling. It was called the Cyclops Eye, a center-mounted headlight hidden behind the car's logo that would pivot as you turned the steering wheel. In theory, it gave you better visibility around curves at night. It was meant to illuminate exactly where you were going, not just what was ahead. But in practice, it was strange and distracting. The movement of the light drew attention away from the road. The mechanism was fragile, and if it failed, you were left with a useless decoration in the middle of your grille. Worse, laws in some states banned it altogether, claiming that 3 headlights violated vehicle codes. So even if you had a Tucker, the Cyclops Eye might not be legal where you lived. It became one of those features that sounded great in an engineer's notebook, but fell apart in the real world. The Tucker itself was a short-lived, ambitious car, and this rotating headlight became a symbol of its quirks. It was a peek into a future that never quite happened, and maybe for good reason. Vacuum-operated windshield wipers were one of the strangest design decisions to come out of mid-century automotive engineering. At a time when cars still lacked many basic conveniences, someone thought it would be smart to power wipers using engine vacuum pressure. And when your foot was off the gas, sure, they worked fine. But the minute you accelerated, say, when trying to merge onto a highway in the rain, the wipers would slow down or stop altogether. Imagine passing a truck in a storm, flooring the gas, and suddenly losing visibility because your wipers could not keep up. It was dangerous, frustrating, and completely illogical. Drivers learned to ease off the throttle just to clear the windshield, a workaround that should never have been necessary. Some cars added separate vacuum reservoirs to help, but that only patched a bad idea instead of fixing it. Eventually, electric motor wipers became the norm, and the vacuum-powered version faded into history. But it left behind a legacy of soaked shirts, white-knuckle drives, and a whole generation of drivers who remembered just how dumb it was to tie windshield visibility to engine behavior. Push-button transmissions sounded like something from the future. and that was the problem. Chrysler introduced this system with a panel of buttons on the dashboard instead of a traditional gear lever. Park, reverse, neutral, and drive. All controlled by pushing labeled buttons that looked more at home on a vending machine than in a car. It seemed novel, even exciting, until drivers realized just how easy it was to hit the wrong button. There were no guards or confirmation steps, just a soft press and a clunk. Some people accidentally shifted into reverse while still moving forward. Others fumbled while trying to park in a hurry. It confused new drivers and raised serious safety questions. Worse, repairs were costly and mechanics often hated dealing with the system. Chrysler eventually backed away from the design, returning to the more familiar lever-style shifter. Today, push-button transmissions have made a comeback, but with layers of safety, sensors, and logic control built in. The early versions from the 1970s lacked all that. They looked slick, but they turned something as basic as shifting into a risky guessing game. Tail fins on the 1959 Cadillac were legendary, but they also blocked your view completely. These soaring, rocket-inspired fins stretched high above the trunk, gleaming in chrome and attitude. They were pure Americana, bold, flamboyant, and utterly impractical. When you looked in your rearview mirror, all you saw were fins. Rear visibility was sacrificed at the altar of style. Parking became guesswork. Lane changes were risky. Even walking around the back of the car felt like navigating around a set of wings. The height and angle of the fins turned the rear of the car into a blind spot factory. Safety had not yet caught up with design, and automakers were still chasing trends inspired by aviation and space travel. The 1959 Cadillac became the poster child for over-the-top styling, but it also became a case study in why form should never overpower function. Today, rear visibility is a priority. Backup cameras, sensors, and slim profiles help drivers see more. But back then, a pair of stylish tail fins could leave you completely blind. They looked like jet turbines, but functioned more like decorative shields against common sense. Hideaway headlights were cool until the cold came in. On cars like the Corvette, the headlights were tucked away under sleek covers that would flip open when you turned them on. It made the car look smooth and modern, like a stealth jet coming to life. But when winter arrived, everything changed. The motors that opened the headlight doors would freeze, or the covers themselves would get stuck halfway. The result? A car with one eye open, one closed, and no visibility on either side. Drivers had to warm up their cars just to see where they were going. Some would get out and manually pry the doors open, sometimes breaking them in the process. What was meant to be high-tech turned into a cold-weather nightmare. The aesthetic was there, sure, but the execution was flawed. Modern cars rarely use hideaway lights anymore, and if they do, the systems are far more advanced. Back then, it was a gamble. You might look great parked in the driveway, but the minute a snowstorm hit, your car could not even open its eyes. Horn rings were supposed to make honking more elegant, but they ended up being fragile and annoying. In many 1950s and 1960s cars, instead of a central horn button, you got a thin circular ring around the steering wheel. It looked classy, matching the chrome and symmetry of the dashboard, but when you actually needed it, say, to alert someone in traffic, it often let you down. Push too hard, and it would crack or snap. Press too softly, and nothing happened. Some rings had awkward pressure points, meaning you had to hit just the right spot to activate the horn. And in moments of panic, that precision went out the window. You were slamming your hand into metal, hoping it would work. Over time, these rings broke easily and were expensive to replace. Drivers either lived with a non-working horn or rigged up aftermarket buttons just to stay legal. Eventually, the classic center push horn returned for good reason. It actually worked. The horn ring might have looked like a feature from the future, but it broke every time you treated it like one. Giant wraparound windshields in the 1950s were eye-catching and sun-blinding. These sweeping curves of glass were designed to give drivers a panoramic view of the road. They wrapped around the front corners of the car, blending seamlessly into the body. It was bold, dramatic, and looked amazing in sales brochures. But sit behind the wheel on a summer day and you quickly found the flaw. The wide curve trapped heat like a greenhouse and reflected sunlight straight into your face. Drivers had to squint constantly, even with visors down. The curved glass distorted reflections, bounced glare from dashboard chrome, and made driving uncomfortable for hours at a time. Some even complained of eye strain or headaches on long trips. Worse still, the large surface area of the glass made it more vulnerable to cracking and harder to replace. It looked like progress, but it felt like punishment. Eventually, windshield designs flattened out and tilted back to reduce glare and increase safety. The wraparound era ended quietly, leaving behind a legacy of form over function. Proof that a wide view is not always a better one. Under-dash record players, yes, actual vinyl players in your car, might be the crown jewel of questionable ideas. Chrysler's Highway Hi-Fi system launched with the promise of letting you spin records while you drove. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Roads were not smooth. Cars vibrated constantly, and vinyl does not take kindly to bumps. The records skipped, the needles jumped. Whole albums could be ruined by a single pothole. Drivers had to balance being a DJ and a navigator, flipping records at red lights and hoping the track did not restart during a turn. It was clunky, unreliable, and expensive. The system required special records and cartridges that were hard to find and easy to damage. Within a few years, it vanished, replaced by 8-track tapes and later cassette players that were far more practical. The Highway Hi-Fi became a trivia answer, a punchline, and a relic of a time when ambition outpaced logic. Cool in theory, total chaos in motion. Fender skirts were the kind of design choice that made cars look sleek, low, and stylish, but only until you needed to change a flat tire. These curved panels covered the upper part of the rear wheel well, creating a smooth line from front to back. They gave cars a polished, aerodynamic silhouette, especially on luxury models from the 1950s and 1960s. But when it came time to actually remove a rear tire, they became a nightmare. To reach the lug nuts, you had to first remove the skirt, usually by unscrewing bolts or unclipping tabs that were tucked in hard-to-reach spots. That meant kneeling in the dirt, fumbling with rusted fittings, and trying not to scratch the paint just to do something as simple as changing a tire. If you were unlucky, the skirt would stick or bend, making the whole process even more frustrating. Roadside emergencies turned into long, miserable battles with sheet metal. And if the tire blowout happened in the rain or on uneven terrain, good luck. Eventually, practicality won out. Fender skirts were slowly phased out, kept only on a few vintage-style models or as aftermarket accessories. Today, mechanics and drivers alike breathe easier knowing they can get to their tires without performing minor surgery on the car's body. Back then, though, fashion took precedence, even if it left you stranded a little longer. Rear-mounted radios with front controls were one of those ideas that sounded clever, until something broke. Some mid-century cars installed the actual radio unit deep inside the back of the dashboard or even near the firewall, with a long cable running to a control dial on the front. This setup saved space and allowed for more decorative dashboard layouts, but it created a mechanical maze for anyone who needed to repair or replace the radio. Instead of unplugging a unit and sliding it out, you had to dig deep into the guts of the car, navigating wires, metal brackets, and sometimes even removing parts of the dash just to reach the radio itself. The cabling that connected the controls to the receiver was also fragile. If it got bent or damaged, the tuning knob on the front would spin freely or jam altogether. Worse, these systems made upgrading nearly impossible. Want a new radio? Prepare to disassemble half the car. It turned a basic feature into a full-blown maintenance headache. Today's infotainment systems may have their own quirks, but at least you can usually access them from the front. Back then, if your radio quit, you were better off humming. It looked futuristic at first, but it aged into one of the least repairable layouts imaginable. The gas cap hidden behind the license plate was one of those automotive tricks that felt cool, right up until you had to use it regularly. Popularized by cars in the 1950s and 1960s, The idea was to preserve the smooth lines of the bodywork by concealing the fuel filler behind a flip-down rear plate. It looked clean, kept the fender free of cutouts, and made the car feel more symmetrical. But the execution? Messy. First, you had to bend down awkwardly to flip the plate open, often getting your hands dirty or scraping your fingers on sharp edges. The nozzle was tucked inside a tight space, meaning you had to angle the fuel pump just right to avoid spilling gas everywhere. In cold weather, the hinge would freeze or rust, making it hard to access at all. And if your license plate frame had sharp corners, they could dig into your knuckles while you fumbled with the cap. Even worse, it was easy to forget to close it properly, leaving the plate rattling or swinging as you drove off. The gimmick eventually fell out of favor, replaced by more practical side-mounted caps with easy access. But for a while, refueling your car meant going headfirst into the bumper and hoping not to come back smelling like gasoline. Opera windows were perhaps the most pointless window ever added to a vehicle. These tiny oval or rectangular portholes were found on the rear pillar of many two-door luxury cars from the 1970s. Their purpose? Purely decorative. They offered no real visibility for passengers and definitely no ventilation. You could not open them. You could not see out of them. And from the inside, they were usually just a piece of dark-tinted glass framed in vinyl and chrome. But car makers kept adding them, hoping to evoke a sense of class and old-world sophistication. Some were even backlit or trimmed in gold. But no matter how fancy they looked, they served no practical function whatsoever. They did not improve safety, they did not enhance passenger comfort, and they certainly did not justify the added cost. Some buyers liked the idea of extra flair. Others just accepted it as part of the package. But many wondered why they were staring at an upholstered wall with a useless peephole cut into it. Eventually, opera windows faded from production as cleaner, more functional designs took over. Today, they are a hallmark of vintage luxury styling, but also a reminder that not every design choice needs to do something. Sometimes it just looks back at you and shrugs. Hard plastic dashboards with no padding were common well into the 1970s, and they remain one of the most dangerous interior design choices ever made. Automakers focused on form and styling, creating sharp, angular dashboards with shiny surfaces that matched the chrome-heavy vibe of the time. But if you were ever in an accident, that dashboard became your enemy. With no give, no cushioning, and no protection, your face or chest hitting it at speed was like colliding with a brick wall. Broken noses, fractured ribs, concussions. It was all common in head-on collisions where the dashboard met the driver. To make things worse, many of these dashboards also featured rigid metal trim, brittle plastics that shattered on impact, and even pointed edges. The lack of attention to interior safety was staggering. Eventually, crash test data and pressure from safety regulators forced automakers to rethink these death traps. Padded dashboards became mandatory. Soft-touch materials, recessed controls, and airbag systems followed. But if you sit in a vintage car today and knock on the dashboard, you will feel it, a solid thud that says, "Do not hit me." It is easy to forget just how unforgiving those early designs were, until you remember what they did when it mattered most. Side-mounted spare tires, often seen in the form of Continental kits, were a strange mix of flair and frustration. These oversized cases were bolted onto the back bumper or even the side of the vehicle, extending the car's length by several inches or even feet. They were meant to evoke a sense of classic European touring style, with the promise of readiness for any road trip. But they also completely ruined weight balance, added bulk to an already long vehicle, and made parking a nightmare. Try parallel parking with a giant metal box sticking out the rear. It became guesswork at best, and a dented bumper at worst. Worse yet, these spare tires were often harder to access than their standard trunk-stored counterparts. You had to unbolt, swing open, or lift a heavy case just to get to the spare. Add in rain, road grime, or rusted latches, and the whole setup became a mess. Drivers discovered that what looked elegant on the showroom floor turned into a hassle the moment they needed it. The look had some nostalgic charm, But that charm wore off quickly when you had to back into a tight garage or squeeze into a city parking spot. Foot-operated high beam switches were the kind of feature that seemed logical until real life got involved. Placed on the floor to the left of the clutch pedal, this metal button allowed drivers to click their high beams on or off with a quick tap of the foot. In theory, it freed up your hands and felt intuitive. But in reality, it was a magnet for trouble. Dirt, slush, and mud would cake around the button during rainy or snowy months, leading to sticky performance or total failure. Sometimes the button would corrode or jam into the carpet, locking your lights into high beam mode and blinding everyone on the road. Drivers also kicked it by accident, toggling the lights unintentionally while shifting or braking. If you wore boots or wide shoes, the placement became even worse, causing you to fumble for the right pedal in the dark. The system was eventually phased out in favor of stock-mounted controls on the steering column, which made far more sense. Today, the idea of aiming your headlights with your foot sounds primitive and risky, but back then it was considered an upgrade. Until your floor mat swallowed the switch and your lights got stuck blazing down a back road. Hood ornaments were once the crown jewels of automotive design, majestic eagles, winged ladies, or roaring lions perched at the edge of your hood. But for all their visual flair, they were incredibly fragile and completely impractical. Most of these ornaments were mounted on spring-loaded bases or rigid brackets that were never built to withstand even mild contact. Tap one in a parking lot and it would bend. Wash your car on a cold day and it might snap clean off. In winter climates, the metal would contract, crack, or break entirely just from a little pressure. And in accidents, even slow-speed fender benders, they often shattered into dangerous shards or launched like projectiles. Worse, they became targets for theft and vandalism. Kids and pranksters would steal them for fun or collect them like trophies. Eventually, safety standards and insurance concerns caught up with style. Automakers began phasing them out or designing them to retract on impact. Today, you might still find subtle embedded emblems, but the age of the full-blown figurine is long gone. They looked regal from a distance, but up close, they were breakable liabilities dressed as art. Beautiful, yes, but they just could not survive the real world. Transparent roof panels on cars like the Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser looked like something out of a spaceship. Long before panoramic sunroofs and tinted glass became common, this station wagon offered a stretched glass panel above the second row of seats. It was bold, futuristic, and totally unprotected. The roof let in sunlight by the gallon, baking passengers alive on hot days. There was no tinting, no UV coating, and certainly no way to open or close the panel for airflow. Rear seat passengers were left squinting and sweating. Some tried to slap fabric over the glass from the inside, while others simply avoided riding back there in the summer altogether. The panel also made the car heat up faster when parked, turning it into a rolling oven before air conditioning had even become standard. It was a feature that sounded impressive in advertisements, but turned into a daily frustration in practice. Eventually, roof glass evolved, becoming smarter, safer, and adjustable. But the Vista Cruiser's see-through roof was a reminder that sometimes innovation runs a little too far ahead of comfort. It was a window to the sky that came with a built-in sunburn. Hand-crank sunroofs were supposed to be the middle ground between fixed glass and motorized convenience. But instead of offering freedom, they usually delivered frustration. The design was simple: a glass or metal panel you opened manually with a rotary handle mounted to the headliner. Sounds easy enough until the handle stripped, the gear jammed, or the track rusted shut. Cranking it open took time and effort, and closing it, especially in a sudden rainstorm, was a stressful race against the elements. The more you used it, the more likely it was to wear out. Eventually, many drivers gave up entirely, choosing to leave it shut forever. In colder climates, these mechanisms were especially prone to freezing up, with moisture causing the tracks to seize or the crank to snap under pressure. And heaven help you if the crank handle itself fell off. Even when they worked, hand-crank sunroofs never felt smooth. They clicked, squeaked, and fought against every inch of movement. While they were marketed as a luxury feature, they often felt like a stubborn relic of a mechanical age. Today, electric sunroofs do the job faster, cleaner, and with far less hassle. The crank? It belongs in the glove box of history, right next to manual choke knobs and cassette adapters. Wrist twist steering sounded like something out of science fiction, and that was exactly the problem. Introduced as a concept by Ford in the early 1960s, the wrist twist system replaced the traditional steering wheel with two small, rotating dials mounted on either side of the dashboard. Each could be turned with a flick of the wrist to steer the car. No big wheel, no familiar feedback, just knobs. The idea was to modernize the driving experience and reduce driver fatigue, but it backfired almost immediately. People were used to turning a full wheel with both hands, not tapping at tiny discs like they were safe-cracking. There was little control, no sense of steering input, and it felt like playing a dangerous game every time you made a turn. Add in tight corners, sudden stops, or panic maneuvers, and the system became downright scary. Drivers hated it. Test reviewers were baffled, and Ford quietly buried the idea before it ever reached mass production. While the wrist twist was technically innovative, it completely ignored driver instinct and safety. The steering wheel might not be flashy, but it works. This system, on the other hand, was too weird to survive and too risky to revive. Front bench seats in sports cars were a classic case of mixed signals. These long, sofa-style seats were great in sedans and family cars, offering comfort and space for three up front. But in a sports car? That was where things got strange. Automakers tried to blend performance with practicality, offering the muscle of a V8 under the hood with a wide, flat seat across the cabin. But bench seats made aggressive driving almost impossible. There was no lateral support, so when you took a sharp corner, you and your passenger would slide across like laundry in a spinning dryer. Worse, the driving position lacked the control and balance that bucket seats provide. Shifting felt awkward, cornering felt loose, and you never quite felt locked in. It was like trying to race while sitting on a couch. Eventually, sports car makers caught on. Bench seats faded away in favor of bolstered, sculpted seats that hugged the driver during high-speed maneuvers. The change was not just about looks, it was about safety, control, and actually enjoying the driving experience. Bench seats may have worked in Grandpa's Buick, but in a car built for speed, they were the equivalent of wearing flip-flops to run a marathon. Ttops were one of the coolest-looking features a car could have in the 1970s and 1980s, and also one of the most frustrating. The idea was simple. Instead of a full convertible or a standard hardtop, you got two removable roof panels over the driver and passenger seats connected by a central support bar. It gave you the open-air feel of a convertible without the full drop-top commitment. But there was one major problem: leaks. Water found its way in no matter how tightly the panels were fitted. Seals wore out fast, alignment was tricky, and after a few months, it was like driving with a sponge above your head. Rain seeped in, puddles formed on the seats, and owners started keeping towels in the back just to mop up the aftermath. Even expensive sports cars were not immune. The issue got so bad that some car manuals included instructions on how to dry out the interior. It was disappointing because the T-top concept had so much potential. It looked sleek. It made the car feel special. But all it took was one downpour to ruin the illusion. Eventually, T-tops disappeared, replaced by better engineered sunroofs and panoramic glass. They are still loved by collectors today, but every enthusiast knows the truth. If you see clouds, you better park it or bring a bucket. Vinyl roofs were supposed to scream luxury, but what they really did was peel, bubble, and rot faster than almost anything else on the car. Introduced in the 1960s and popular well into the 1970s, these fake convertible tops were made of textured vinyl stretched over the steel roof, often with decorative stitching or chrome trim. The idea was to mimic the look of a soft top without the mechanics of a real convertible. But reality had other plans. The vinyl cracked under sun exposure, trapped moisture underneath, and created perfect conditions for rust to form. After just a year or two, what once looked plush and elegant turned into a bubbling, flaking mess. And once the damage started, it spread fast. Water seeped in, rust bloomed, and the underlying roof metal deteriorated without anyone seeing it. Some owners tried to patch it. Others just gave up and ripped the whole thing off. It became a maintenance nightmare that no one wanted to deal with. Eventually, the auto industry moved on to cleaner rooflines and painted finishes that held up better over time. But for a brief moment in car history, vinyl roofs were everywhere, turning glossy new sedans into crumbling projects faster than you could say oxidation. Digital dashboards in the 1980s were a classic case of overpromising and underdelivering. Buicks, Lincolns, and other high-end models rolled out glowing screens with animated numbers, bar graphs, and touch-sensitive controls. It looked like something out of a spaceship, and that was the selling point. But once the novelty wore off, the problems set in. These dashboards were notoriously glitchy. Screens would flicker, readings would vanish, and entire clusters would shut off for no reason. Speedometers froze, fuel gauges blinked nonsense, and trying to drive at night with a flickering dash felt like navigating through a bad science fiction movie. Repairs were expensive and difficult, often requiring full replacements because parts were too specific or already obsolete. Worse, the displays were hard to read in direct sunlight and lacked the precision of analog gauges. What was meant to feel advanced ended up being a frustrating downgrade. Automakers eventually figured out better digital tech, but those early attempts left a lot of drivers squinting and guessing. Today, digital dashboards are sharper, brighter, and way more reliable, but the ghost of those early blinking blue-green numbers still haunts car history. They look like the future, but they forgot to make it functional. The 1982 Dodge Rampage was what happened when someone decided a car should also be a truck, but not too much of either. It looked like a compact coupe from the front, with front-wheel drive and all the manners of a commuter car. But in the back, a small truck bed that could haul mulch, lumber, or a few cinder blocks if you did not mind scraping the shocks. It was Dodge's attempt to create a car-truck hybrid, following the path blazed by the Ford Ranchero and Chevrolet El Camino, but on a smaller, more modest scale. The Rampage could fit in tight parking spots, cruise the highway, and still carry a lawnmower on Saturday morning. But its awkward size and identity left it stranded between segments. Truck buyers thought it was too soft. Car buyers thought it was too rugged. Dodge only made it for 3 model years, and it quietly disappeared by 1984. But in hindsight, the Rampage was ahead of its time, an early answer to the crossover question before anyone was even asking it. It was not fast, it was not strong, but it was clever, oddly charming, and unmistakably weird. The 1982 Chrysler Imperial wanted to bring old-school luxury into the digital age, but the transition was rocky. On the outside, it wore the sharp lines, boxy silhouette, and gleaming chrome trim that screamed old-money prestige. It looked like something a retired executive would drive to a private golf club in Palm Springs. But on the inside, it was trying hard to be the future. Chrysler loaded the Imperial with one of the earliest digital dashboards, voice alerts, and a fuel injection system controlled by a primitive onboard computer. Unfortunately, none of it worked the way it should have. The electronic dash flickered. The fuel injection system was erratic. The engine stumbled and surged, leaving both drivers and mechanics confused and frustrated. At a time when Chrysler desperately needed a win, the Imperial felt like a bloated experiment. Reliability took a hit, gas mileage was poor, and the ride, while soft, felt disconnected from the road, like floating on a sofa bolted to a shopping cart. Chrysler marketed the Imperial as a return to elegance, even offering special Frank Sinatra editions, complete with branded cassettes. But all the names and styling in the world could not hide the clunky mechanics and aging foundation underneath. Sales were slow, and buyers were not impressed. In trying to bridge the past and the future, the Imperial ended up stuck in a limbo of unfulfilled promises. It was a luxury car that no longer understood what luxury meant. The 1970 Chrysler 300 Hurst was what happened when brute force shook hands with pure luxury. Built in collaboration with Hurst Performance, this was not your average muscle machine. It was a heavyweight brawler wearing gold-trimmed gloves. With only a few hundred made, it was rare right from the start. Under the hood sat a 440 cubic inch TNT V8 that churned out enough torque to peel the asphalt off the road, and yet the 300 Hurst was long, wide, and unapologetically plush. The signature white and gold paint job with fiberglass hood scoops and a deck lid spoiler announced its arrival with style. Hurst badges made sure no one mistook it for a soft cruiser. Inside, the car was pure Chrysler comfort, big seats, sweeping dash, and enough room to stretch your legs like you were in a first-class cabin. It was heavy, sure, but it moved like it had something to prove. This was not about finesse. It was about showing that luxury could still throw a punch. Today, the Chrysler 300 Hurst lives in the shadows of more famous muscle cars, but those who know it revere it. It was the kind of car you took to a business meeting in the morning and raced after sundown. The 1971 Ford Pinto will always be remembered, but not for the reasons Ford hoped. Introduced as a small, affordable car to compete with Japanese imports, the Pinto had a compact body, a lightweight design, and styling that was modest but modern. On paper, it looked like a winner. It was simple, fuel-efficient, and offered in multiple trims and body styles. But hidden behind its economy car charm was a design flaw that would define its legacy: the placement of the fuel tank. Positioned just behind the rear axle, the tank was vulnerable in rear-end collisions. Worse, in some cases, it could rupture and cause fires. The controversy exploded when internal documents revealed Ford had calculated the cost of lawsuits against the cost of redesigning the tank and chose the cheaper path. Still, the Pinto sold well. Over 3 million units hit the road, driven by budget-conscious buyers who appreciated its size and price. The car itself was not inherently bad, and many owners had years of problem-free driving. But the stigma stuck. Today, the Pinto is a symbol of corporate corner-cutting and public backlash, an example of how a single design choice can overshadow everything else. Weird? Yes. Infamous? Even more so. The 1981 AMC Eagle SX/4 was one of those rare ideas that arrived before the world was ready. It was a compact two-door with four-wheel drive, blending off-road ruggedness with urban practicality. In theory, it was brilliant. In execution, it was flawed. AMC struggled with quality control, and the Eagle SX/4 suffered from awkward handling, creaky interiors, and a drivetrain that felt more tractor than car. The design was boxy, and the cabin felt cramped. Yet underneath it all, there was real innovation, just buried under years of corporate dysfunction and cost-cutting. AMC was already on its last legs, and the Eagle could not save it. Drivers who owned one often appreciated its grit, but they also endured its breakdowns and quirks. Eventually, Subaru and other brands perfected the all-wheel drive formula. The Eagle was just a prototype for a future it would never see. The 1970 Pontiac Judge was loud, brash, and unapologetically bold. It was not just a muscle car, it was a declaration. With its outrageous color schemes, massive decals, and raucous engine growl, the Judge made sure nobody missed its arrival. Under the hood, it packed the Ram Air 3 or the optional Ram Air 4 V8, both offering blistering performance. The name itself came from a comedy routine, but the car was dead serious. It was built for the young, the wild, and the fearless. And it delivered. It could tear down a quarter-mile with ease, and the handling was tight enough to carve corners without flinching. Every inch of the Judge was designed to turn heads, from the Endura front bumper to the rear spoiler. It shouted muscle in a world where cars were starting to play it safe. And while the GTO had already earned its reputation by the late 1960s, the Judge pushed it into mythic territory. This was the version everyone remembers. This was the one people still talk about. It was performance wrapped in personality, and personality wrapped in power. Today, the Judge is missed not just because of how it drove, but because of what it represented, the height of muscle car confidence before everything got quieter. The 1960 Plymouth XNR was one of the most striking concept cars to ever roll out of Detroit, because it refused to play by any of the rules. Designed by the legendary Virgil Exner, the XNR was named after him, and it looked like a machine pulled straight from a comic book. Asymmetrical from front to back, the car featured a single-seat cockpit on the driver's side, offset by a large fin that rose boldly behind the headrest. There was no matching passenger seat, at least not one that matched in height or focus. The design was intentionally lopsided, unapologetically dramatic, and unlike anything else seen before or since. Under the sculpted hood was a slant-six engine tuned for performance, because this was not just a pretty face. The XNR was meant to perform. But as with many concept cars, it was too radical for production. The world was not ready. After a brief tour of the show circuit, the car was shipped overseas to avoid destruction. It eventually surfaced in the Middle East, and years later was fully restored by a collector who saw its brilliance. Today, it is one of one, a piece of rolling sculpture. The XNR was not designed to fit in. It was built to stand alone, forever weird and forever unforgettable. The 1983 Lincoln Continental Mark VI diesel was an answer to a question nobody asked. During the early 1980s oil crunch, Lincoln decided to offer a diesel version of its full-size luxury coupe. The result was predictably bizarre. Under the hood was a 5.7-liter V8 diesel borrowed from General Motors, and it sounded like a farm truck. Loud, slow, and unrefined. The acceleration was glacial. The engine shook the whole chassis, and the typical Lincoln smoothness was replaced with diesel rattle and hesitation. Worse, the engine itself was unreliable. Head gasket failures, cold start issues, poor longevity. Buyers expecting serene luxury were handed a car that felt like it belonged in a tractor pull. Inside, the plush velour seats and wood grain trim clashed with the constant growl of the diesel clatter. Fuel economy was only marginally better than a gas V8, and the performance sacrifice made it hard to justify. The diesel Mark VI was a novelty, and not a good one. It was dropped quietly, almost as if Lincoln hoped everyone would forget it ever existed. And for the most part, they did. It was not just a bad car, it was a bad idea. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442W30 was a muscle car for people who knew exactly what they wanted. It was not flashy like some of its competitors. It did not have wild graphics or over-the-top styling. What it had was performance, pure, deliberate performance. The W30 package meant a ram air hood, fiberglass scoops, high-output camshaft, and serious internal upgrades. Under the hood sat a 455 cubic inch V8 that churned out brutal torque and ran hard through every gear. This was a street fighter in a suit. It looked mature, but underneath it was itching for a race. The 442 was all about balance. Power, sure, but also control. The suspension was tight. The brakes were solid. It felt like a full package, not just an engine with doors. And the W30 took all of that to the next level. Today, it is one of the most respected names in the muscle car world, not because it shouted the loudest, but because it delivered, day in, day out. For those who knew, it was the one to beat, and for those who drove one, it was never forgotten. The 1956 Buick Centurion was the kind of car that made you pause and say, "Wait, what am I looking at?" With its fire red and white fiberglass body, bubble canopy, and sci-fi proportions, it looked like something that should be hovering, not rolling. But buried in that bold styling was something truly unique, a rear-mounted camera instead of a rear-view mirror. Yes, in 1956, Buick put a camera in the back of a car and fed the video to a screen in the dashboard. It was a concept feature that would not become reality in production cars for another 50 years. The interior was equally futuristic, with push-button controls, wraparound seating, and a dash that seemed more spaceship than sedan. The Centurion also ditched the usual rear pillars, giving it an airy, glass-filled feel that earned it serious attention at auto shows. Of course, the fiberglass body made mass production a no-go, and while the camera was a marvel, the technology just was not ready. Still, the 1956 Centurion proved Buick was not afraid to think way outside the box. It was not built to be practical. It was built to make people believe the future was closer than they thought. And for one brief, wild moment, it did exactly that. The 1980 Chevrolet Citation was General Motors' first big push into front-wheel drive, an effort to modernize its lineup and fight off foreign competition. But the launch was rushed, and the cracks showed almost immediately. Brake failures, rusted bodies, suspensions that collapsed under pressure, transmission issues dogged the early models, and misaligned steering columns made handling feel like guesswork. The Citation came out strong in sales, but quickly earned a reputation for unreliability. It was boxy, yes, but that was not the problem. The problem was that it felt unfinished. Cheap materials, inconsistent quality, and a driving experience that never inspired confidence. GM had marketed it as innovative, practical, and perfectly American. But buyers soon found themselves stuck with cars that shuddered, squeaked, and stalled. Lawsuits piled up, recalls followed, and the goodwill dried up fast. It even became a punchline in late-night comedy, symbolizing Detroit's worst instincts. What should have been a new chapter for Chevrolet became a footnote of frustration. The Citation did not just fail, it taught an entire generation not to trust promises stamped in chrome. The 1970 Chevrolet Chevel SS454 was not just a muscle car. It was a factory-built monster that growled with authority the second you touched the gas. At the heart of it was the LS6 engine, a big block brute that delivered 450 horsepower straight off the assembly line. That was unheard of at the time. It was raw, brutal torque packed into a mid-sized body that looked like it was always in motion, even when parked. The dual stripes, the cowl induction hood, and the rumble from those chrome-tipped exhaust pipes made the Chevel impossible to ignore. It was the kind of car that made your palms sweat just sitting in the driver's seat. Quarter-mile times were legendary, and this car did not care about finesse. It was about dominance. People who drove it felt like kings, and those who lined up next to it at a red light, they usually regretted it. The Chevel SS454 was the kind of car you saved all summer to buy, all winter to fix, and never stopped bragging about. It represented the peak of American muscle, before the rules changed and the power faded. Today, it is not just missed, it is worshipped. The 1935 Stout Scarab looked like a rolling beetle and drove like an idea whose time never came. Designed by William Bushnell Stout, this strange, bloated pod was often called the first minivan, decades before minivans were a thing. Its rounded Art Deco body looked like it had been sculpted by a cartoonist with a soft spot for streamlining. But the weirdness was not just skin deep. It had a rear-mounted Ford V8 engine, unibody construction, and an interior that could be reconfigured with movable chairs, like a rolling living room. No joke. Some versions even had a fold-out table in the middle. Stout believed the car should be more than just transportation. He thought it should be a mobile lounge, a social space, a tool for life. But at a price of $5,000 in the middle of the Great Depression, few buyers were willing to roll that kind of dice. Fewer than 10 were made, and even fewer exist today. The Stout Scarab never caught on, but it left a mark. Every time you see a modern minivan with sliding seats, a rear engine, or a spacious cabin, you are seeing an echo of Stout's vision. It was strange, it was expensive, but it was also way ahead of the curve. The 1984 Ford EXP was supposed to be a sporty two-seater version of the Ford Escort, a compact car reimagined for young drivers looking for flair. But the EXP ended up with none of the performance and even less personality. The engine was weak, especially compared to the Sportier coupes coming out of Japan at the time. The handling was sluggish, the steering vague, and the road feel uninspired. For a car marketed as bold and different, it looked oddly dull. Ford tried hard to pitch it as a fun commuter car, sleek, affordable, and modern. But in reality, it felt more like a lonely Escort missing its back seat. It lacked excitement. It lacked buzz. Even the advertising could not figure out what the EXP was trying to be. Some versions added a turbo, but it was too little, too late. Consumers shrugged. Sales tanked. and just a few years later, the model disappeared with barely a whisper. Even among Ford enthusiasts, the EXP has no cult following. The EXP was not a disaster because it did something wrong. It was a disaster because it never did anything right. It promised a thrill and delivered a yawn. The 1971 Dodge Charger Super Bee was not built for subtlety. It was built to roar. With its aggressive stance, bold graphics, and unmistakable bulging hood, this muscle car was a rolling declaration of speed and attitude. It wore its name proudly, and for good reason. Under the hood, drivers could choose from a range of powerhouse engines, including the legendary 426 Hemi and the 446 pack, both capable of turning a straight road into a thrill ride. The styling was pure drama: twin-scooped hoods, eye-searing color options, and side stripes that made it look fast even when parked. Inside, it was all business, with rally gauges, bucket seats, and a driver-focused layout that made you feel like a street racer even on a grocery run. Though it only lasted 1 year in the Charger body, the 1971 Super Bee still stands as a snapshot of the muscle car era at full throttle. It was loud, flashy, and unapologetically wild, a car that never asked for attention but always got it. Decades later, when one passes by, people still stop and stare, drawn to its raw energy and rebellious spirit. The Super Bee never faded. It just kept buzzing. The 1948 Tucker 48 was not just weird, it was dangerously ahead of its time, and that may have been its downfall. Nicknamed the Tucker Torpedo, this sleek, rear-engine sedan came from the mind of Preston Tucker, a man who believed the post-war car market was ready for revolution. At first glance, it looked like a spaceship, low-slung, long, and wrapped in aerodynamic curves. But the weirdest and most brilliant feature was dead center, a third headlight mounted in the middle of the hood that turned with the steering wheel. They called it the Cyclops Eye. It gave the car a strange, bug-eyed stare that turned heads and sparked imagination. Beneath the sleek body, the Tucker was filled with innovations: seat belts, a roll bar, a pop-out windshield, and a rear-mounted engine borrowed from a helicopter. Yes, a helicopter. But in 1948, these safety features were seen as odd, even suspicious. The big three automakers felt threatened, and a combination of government pressure, bad press, and financial sabotage killed the company after only 51 cars were built. Today, the Tucker 48 is a legend, not just for its looks, but for what it dared to offer. A car that was weird, bold, and years ahead of what Detroit was ready to build. The 1981 DeLorean DMC12 looked like it drove straight out of a science fiction film, and in some ways, it did. Its stainless steel body and gull-wing doors made it instantly iconic, turning heads even while parked. But under the surface, it was a troubled machine, underpowered, overpriced, difficult to manufacture. The Peugeot Renault Volvo V6 engine made just over 100 horsepower, laughable for a sports car. Quality control was a nightmare, and early models were plagued with electrical gremlins, loose panels, and poorly fitted parts. Door seals leaked, dashboards warped. Then came the scandal. Company founder John DeLorean was arrested in a cocaine sting operation, and suddenly the car's futuristic gleam turned into tabloid fodder. Production halted, and the dream unraveled. Despite its later fame in pop culture, the DMC-12 was a commercial disaster. It failed to meet its lofty goals and left behind a warehouse of unsold ambition. Today, people remember the car more for its movie legacy than its actual performance on the road. It is a symbol of vision, failure, and what happens when style moves faster than substance. The 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 302 was a race car in disguise. Built to qualify for Trans-American racing, it had to follow strict engine size rules. But that did not stop Ford from turning it into a legend. With its high-revving 302 cubic inch V8 and close ratio 4-speed gearbox, the Boss 302 was built to scream. It was not the fastest in a straight line, but that was not the point. It was all about handling, quick corners, tight turns, track precision in a street-ready package. The Boss 302 had a unique look too. Blacked-out hood, bold stripes, rear window slats, and a front chin spoiler that made it look fast just standing still. Inside, it was all business. No frills, just function. It was made for the road, but born for the circuit. And while the Mustang had plenty of wild variations over the years, the Boss 302 stood out as the one that proved muscle could be smart. It was power with discipline, noise with control. Today, it remains one of the most beloved Mustangs ever built, a reminder that true performance does not always come from brute force alone. The 1957 Chevrolet El Morocco was part Bel Air, part Cadillac, and all ambition. Conceived by Canadian entrepreneur Reuben Allender, the El Morocco was a hand-built attempt to turn Chevrolet's popular Bel Air into something that looked and felt more like a luxury Eldorado. He wanted to offer middle-class drivers a taste of Cadillac class without the Cadillac price. The changes were subtle but effective. Custom fins, Cadillac-style grille inserts, unique badging, and extra chrome in all the right places. Even the wheel covers mimicked Cadillacs. But under the flash, it was still very much a Bel Air, with the same engine options, the same chassis, and the same familiar ride. Allender built fewer than 30 El Moroccos in 1957, following an even smaller run in 1956. The price was high, too high for most Chevrolet buyers, and not quite prestigious enough for luxury car shoppers. It landed in a no-man's land of identity. Still, for those who bought it, the El Morocco offered something rare: individuality. Today, it is one of the rarest Chevrolets of the 1950s, a stylish footnote in the history of American customization. It did not start a trend, but it sure made one. The 1983 Honda Prelude was supposed to usher in a new chapter of Japanese sportiness, but it stumbled at the starting line. This was the first-generation Prelude to reach American shores, and expectations were high. Honda had already built a reputation for quality, value, and clever engineering. But the Prelude, despite its sporty looks and pop-up headlights, lacked the excitement buyers were promised. The engine was weak, the acceleration was slow, and reliability, usually Honda's strongest suit, suffered from teething problems in the new design. Suspension components wore out quickly, interior trim rattled, and while the car handled decently in corners, it felt gutless in straight-line performance. It looked like a sports car. It acted like an underpowered commuter. Competing against more powerful coupes and hot hatches, the Prelude fell flat. It did have its fans, mostly for its futuristic dash and tidy size, but even loyal Honda buyers expected more. Later generations would fix these flaws and turn the Prelude into a beloved icon. But this first outing left a bland impression. Today, the original Prelude is rarely remembered, not because it was terrible, but because it was underwhelming, a rare stumble from a company that usually got it right. The 1971 Buick GSX Stage 1 was the kind of muscle car that wore a tie to the fight and still knocked you out in the first round. Buick had a reputation for smooth, luxurious rides, cars built for long cruises and quiet comfort. But the GSX flipped that script without tearing it up. Under the hood sat the Stage 1 455 cubic inch V8, a torque-heavy powerhouse that quietly outperformed some of the loudest names in the game. With well over 500 pound-feet of torque, it could flatten your spine at a stoplight. Yet it did all this without screaming for attention. The GSX came in two standout colors, Saturn Yellow and Apollo White, both with bold racing stripes, rear spoilers, and blacked-out grills. It looked sharp, not showy. Inside, it was all Buick. Soft bucket seats, full instrumentation, and just enough wood trim to remind you that you were not in a stripped-down street racer. But when you dropped the hammer, everything changed. It was fast, refined, and completely intimidating when it needed to be. The GSX Stage 1 did not need gimmicks. It was a high-class assassin on wheels. Today, it is remembered as one of the most underrated muscle cars of the era. It proved that luxury and performance were not opposites, and that a little elegance could still tear up the pavement when the time was right. Sometimes the real threat is the one that stays quiet until you are already in the rear view. The 1975 AMC Pacer looked like it had been designed by someone who started with a fishbowl and worked backward. Nearly half of the car's surface area was glass, giving it the nickname the Flying Fishbowl. Its bulbous shape, wide stance, and massive windows gave it an almost aquatic feel, as if it belonged underwater instead of the open road. AMC marketed it as the first wide small car, a contradiction that somehow made perfect sense in the era of bell-bottoms and disco. The front passenger door was longer than the driver's, intended to make rear seat access easier. The dash was deep and curved, and the whole car seemed like it was smiling awkwardly at the world. Under the hood, it offered small six-cylinder engines and, in later years, a few underpowered V8s. It was not fast, it was not nimble, but it was unique. People either loved it or mocked it, and the design quickly became dated in a decade already full of questionable fashion. Yet despite the ridicule, the Pacer has become a cult classic. It is weird, it is lovable, and it perfectly captures a moment when American cars were still trying to figure out what small really meant. If one of these designs brought back memories, drop your story below, hit like, and subscribe for more car chaos from the past.